Good evening and welcome to a short course on local planning. My name is Prince Cowan. I am the Administrative Supervisor in the Planning and Building Department. I've worked with the city for 25 years and I am happy to be your moderator tonight. The Department of Commerce provides this forum for us tonight, and the short course is always free and open to the public, anyone who wants to attend. And the Department of Commerce has been presenting the short course to community since 1977. Before we get into the program, I'd like to state our land acknowledgement. We'd like to acknowledge that the Southern Salish Sea region lies on the unceded and ancestral land of the Coast Salish peoples, the Duwamish, Muckleshoot, Puyallup, Skykomish, Snoqualmie, Snohomish, Suquamish, Tulalip, and other tribes of the Puget Sound Salish people. That present-day city of Kirkland is in the traditional heartland of the Lake people and River people. We honor with gratitude the land itself, the first people, who have reserved treaty rights and continue to live here since time immemorial, and their ancestral heritage. Today you're going to hear about the basic set of land use laws in Washington State, along with a focus on our statewide planning framework, the Growth Management Act, GMA. We'll have a brief break, and then the second half of the program is about the roles in planning, effective meetings, the Open Public Meetings Act, and an introduction to the Public Records Act. This is a lot of information in a short period of time, but we hope it will provide you with the foundation and context to move forward with more knowledge about and willingness to increase learning of urban planning. I'll first introduce just a few housekeeping issues. You've seen the refreshments, just help yourselves to those throughout the evening. The gate closes off all the rest of City Hall, but the restrooms, public restrooms, are just in the back corner. And for those of you on Zoom tonight, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat if you like. You can rename yourself by hitting on the little ellipses, the 3 dots in the corner on your Zoom square. List your first name and affiliation just to make connections and get to know each other. The chat Q&A is open, so anyone who wants to ask a question, feel free. After each session, the speaker will ask if there's questions. So we do have staff that will be monitoring the chat and also here in person. So we'll give a chance to have a few minutes to answer your questions, and then there will also be questions at the end of the session. To save time, each of the presenters will introduce the one coming after. And there are copies of the agendas. There are the short booklets that are also available out in the lobby. If you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, we do have staff available that can make copies for you. And then just real quick in review for the agenda for tonight, we are reviewing the legal basis of planning in Washington, the comprehensive plan basics, the Kirkland 2044 comp plan update, roles and responsibilities, open government laws, and finally closing comments with our planning and building director, Adam Weinstein. So thank you to all the speakers who are presenting tonight. And thank you to all of you who have taken the time to come tonight and learn about a short course on local planning, investing your time in our community. And special thanks to the Department of Commerce who has provided this training tonight. It touches on every aspect of the community, including housing, infrastructure, and economic development. Commerce works with local governments like Kirkland and tribes and civic leaders, and they manage a diverse portfolio of over 100 programs and boards and commissions, and all focused on helping communities achieve positive growth so all residents may thrive and prosper. If you'd like to learn more about the services that they provide, we do have Senior Planner Ted Varnagas that is here tonight, and you can contact him directly. And those on Zoom, his contact information is added in the chat, and it is also at the on the last slide of my presentation. We do also give special thanks to our partners, the Planning Association of Washington, Washington City's Insurance Authority, American Planning Association, Washington Chapter, and the AWC Risk Management Service. So these organizations partner with the Department of Commerce to provide these short courses, and helps so that they can be held and provide basic information about planning law, open government, and best practices around land use planning. The insurance agencies sponsor these courses because land use law is a significant source of risk for local governments, and these agencies want their members to have the training so that they can avoid risk. The Planning Association sponsors the short course because they are very efficient vehicles for sharing information about how we plan in Washington State. On the Department of Commerce website, there is a lot of other information that is not covered here in tonight's short course. Of course, we only have so much time, but you can go to their website and you can definitely download another copy or a copy of the short book that you got, but then there's also a more detailed resource guidebook that is available as well. If you're an elected official or board and commission member, you can receive a certificate of completion for the Open Public Meetings Act portion. You can print off a copy directly from the website, complete it, and then submit it to staff with your organization so that you can get credit for having taken this class. And if you want more information than that, what's on their website, you can definitely look at some of these other resources that we have available. We'd especially like to highlight the Municipal Resource Services Center, MRSC. They have answers to a lot of local government questions, planning history, planning law, model ordinances, as well as many other land use planning topics. And that is it for now. Are there any questions before we get into the program? Yes. Yes, we can get copies of that. Yes, absolutely. Our first presenter is Senior Assistant City Attorney Stephanie Kroll. Stephanie has been the Senior Assistant City Attorney for Kirkland for 7 years, primarily providing assistance to all departments with regard to land use, code enforcement, and general litigation matters. Stephanie has practiced law for 35 years with a career that has spanned from preparing petitions to terminating the parent-child relationship for the Attorney General's office, to trying tort cases in private practice, to trying felony cases as a deputy prosecuting attorney. Eventually, Stephanie settled in a small firm where she practiced municipal defense focused on general tort, land use, and flooding claims. Stephanie truly enjoys working with the great legal team at Kirkland, and she especially appreciates the talented city staff who are so brilliant that they make her look good every day. So presenting the legal basis of planning in Washington, Stephanie Kroll.
Thank you, Prince, and good evening to everyone here and also on Zoom. It indicates that I am presenting this because I didn't prepare it. We are very thankful to the Department of Commerce who prepared it. Although some of my notes may be my own, you'll probably know which ones those are. I want to go through very quickly what the land use regulations are in our state and just the framework for how we practice land use and planning, and some of the other presenters are going to be more specific. I do have a little bit of allergy throat, so I apologize. Hope everyone can hear me well. You can see here on an introductory slide that we have a little snippet of our own city of Kirkland. And the reason land use planning is so important is because of the impact it has on everyone who lives in the United States. There are high stakes on all sides. There are preservation of critical areas and the natural beauty of the state, which is often in competition with development resources that people need, such as mining, fishing, food and agriculture, and money and development so that we can house all the people who live here. So there are often no easy answers, and without guidance from the state, there would often be no answer whatsoever, because competing interests are always at stake in land use, always. There are long-lasting consequences to shaping our communities, and that goes right down to the local level. It starts with state regulations, but when you shape your communities, it starts right here at the local level. And the land use decision-making process and the framework for that process is critical to making the best decisions we can, given the information we have. And litigation frequently results. I could call it job security, but in fact, it's really sad that it results, and there are often pros and cons on both sides, and I'm thankful that I get to represent the excellent people that work at Kirkland. It doesn't always mean I don't have empathy for whoever has a competing interest, but ultimately, the court gets to decide when litigation starts. I'm not sure how to advance this. I did. Try this. Oh, it's more aggressive. Got it. Okay. I was pushing the arrows on the keyboard. I want everyone to know. Apparently, I was not pushing aggressive enough, which is very unusual for me. So we'll just get to that. The sources of planning and land use law start with our state constitution. It actually starts with the United States Constitution. And when Washington became a state, they had their own constitution, very similar to the United States Constitution, with some important differences that I've learned in my 30 years of practicing law. We go down to statutes. Those are enacted by the legislature. There's different kinds of statutes shown on this slide. And then we get down to city ordinances and resolutions. And our ordinances enact the laws of our city. They become codified. They tell us the rules and regulations for how we're going to plan our city and the steps we need to follow. Many of our ordinances and rules and regulations flow from the ideas that are adopted in our comprehensive plan. And the comprehensive plan, I believe other people will be explaining that more further. You're going to get a big overview from me and a deep dive from other people, just to let you know. But the comprehensive plan is going to be almost the goals and missions of the city. What do we want for different parts of the city? And when we have a comprehensive plan, then we can dig into the details and get things right with an overarching plan to guide us. Sometimes it seems like cities don't have a plan, but in Washington State, based on the Growth Management Act, which was enacted by our state legislature, all cities must have a plan. So especially in this state, I think we do a better job of having a plan than others. And again, always competing interests. So even with a comprehensive plan, we have disagreements that we need to work out. After that, we have administrative regulations in the city, and then we go on when we can't decide, when we have disagreements between ourselves, our different divisions in the city, and with citizens, and between citizens who are looking at our rules and regulations, trying to decide what they want to do. We go to court, and we have court decisions that then guide us. And then we have, of course, very important part of the city's government and regulations are our boards and agencies and commissions. And we have all of those, mostly volunteer, some that are not, even the ones that aren't strictly volunteer are spend so much volunteer time on it that they just need to be applauded because they're helping everyone get the best out of living in the state and this city that they can. I was more aggressive and that worked. Okay, we have our state authority for zoning. In the previous slide, I told you that we had the Constitution. And under our state Constitution, Article 11, Section 11, gives us our legal authority for zoning and land use regulations. And basically it says that any county, city, town, or township has the authority and may make and enforce within its limits all such police powers, sanitary, and other regulations as are not in conflict with general laws. You're going to hear more about the Growth Management Act. It has 14 goals that guide development and adoption of comprehensive plans. They're not listed in any particular order, so the state legislature has not told us which goal is most important. All of them are equally important, except to the extent that some of them are written to be goals that are encouraged, and some of them are written to be goals that are strongly recommended. So we have to decide as a city, based on our particular circumstances, which goals are most important to us. And also some goals have changed with time. For instance, the housing goal was strengthened recently from encourage affordable housing to cities shall plan for and accommodate affordable housing. And there was a House bill that was recently passed, House Bill 1110, and that is increasing densities in residential areas. And the reason for that House bill, the new section says as follows. The legislature finds that Washington is facing an unprecedented housing crisis for its current population and lack of housing choices, and is not likely to meet the affordability goals for future populations. In order to meet the goal of 1 million new homes by 2044 and an enhanced quality of life and environmental protection, innovative housing policies will need to be adopted. Increasing housing options that are more affordable to various income levels is critical to achieving the state's housing goals. That's just one example of how we are shaped by the state legislature's dictation of what we need to do at the city level. We still take that and do what we think is best, but that's a change and a recent change in the types of zoning that we're going to be seeing in the city. I might have missed one there. Okay, there we go. Let me see. Let me go back even more. I got a little too aggressive there, sorry. So we have federal planning laws that influence our planning, such as the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, and the fact that tribes are recognized as distinct, independent political communities. Tribal interests may intersect with local land use planning. There are 29 federally recognized tribal governments within Washington and 25 Indian reservations. Tribes are recognized as distinct, independent political communities wholly responsible for planning and permitting on reservation lands. However, they also participate in what we call government-to-government consultation on a variety of issues like transportation, land use, gaming, hunting, and fishing. So the cities use their utmost resources to work with the tribes to have coordinated planning around the types of infrastructure that benefits everyone in the state. The Clean Water Act and National Pollution Discharge Elimination System are also extremely important permitting in the city at the local level. They flow from the federal Clean Water Act, and the city has strict regulations about what it can do with stormwater discharges, how it can make its stormwater system efficient, effective, what it can and can't do, what it can and cannot discharge into the lake. And those regulations have become more strict, and we are seeing our lake waters becoming more clean, although, again, certainly not back like it was 100 years ago. But our effort is to house as many people as we can in a clean and safe environment. We have the State Subdivision Act. It was adopted in 1969 and, of course, establishes a process for subdividing land for development. The subdivisions, which are generally 5 lots or more, are for residential neighborhoods. Short subdivisions for residential neighborhoods are generally 4 or fewer lots. And while some early communities were master planned, many grew organically before there were state subdivision laws. And we are every day facing issues about subdivisions that were created under our new laws and what we can do and recognize as vested rights in subdivisions that were created before our state subdivision laws. The state subdivision law is very important for the protection of the public health and safety. And in fact, you cannot subdivide property unless you meet the requirements of the state subdivision law, which the city is the front line of making sure those requirements are met. And those requirements that you must provide for the public health, safety, and general welfare, and for open spaces, drainage ways, streets or roads, alleys, other public ways, transit stops, potable water supplies, sanitary waste, parks and recreation, playgrounds, schools, and sidewalks and other planning features that assure safe walking conditions for those students who must walk to and from school. So we have a lot of questions when subdivisions come into the city, and a lot of neighbors ask questions about subdivisions. And keep in mind that the city must ensure all of those aspects that I just listed to you are present and prepared for when they approve a subdivision. And we welcome comments from the public and any time when you think that those particular aspects are not being given the attention they deserve. Next, we have the State Environmental Policy Act, what we call SEPA. This was adopted in 1971, and it is to protect the environment in the face of allowing planned required development. So we want to make sure as we develop our cities and provide safe, clean spaces for people to live, that we also protect the environment. And I always like to say that SEPA is the state's policy to ensure that we don't pave paradise and put up a parking lot. Parking lots are necessary, but we don't want to pave all of paradise to do it. So the main question that is decided under SEPA, what we call a threshold determination, whether or not an act is going to have a probable adverse significant impact on the environment that is not or will not be mitigated by the city's currently adopted development regulations. So we go through SEPA on projects that are going to have an impact on the development. Many times, we can answer those questions by applying our own development regulations. For instance, we don't allow people to put certain wattages of lights all around their house because the adverse impact on their neighbors is something, an environmental impact we don't want. If they're living next to wooded lands, we still don't allow certain lights and noises because of the adverse impacts on wildlife that will be living in those wooded areas. So we have adopted regulations that already take care of many SEPA concerns, but we go through each project to ensure, each project that's required to go through SEPA to ensure that we are protecting the environment. We also have a special Shoreline Management Act. This was adopted in 1971 by a citizen initiative, which is just an interesting side note that the legislature didn't propose the Shoreline Management Act. The citizens petitioned for it. And then it was enacted after a citizen initiative. So good on the citizens of Washington State. It was predicated upon a federal statute. Its purpose, of course, is to protect Washington shorelines in the context of development. It applies to shorelines, rivers, lakes, wetlands, and flood zones. So not just Puget Sound, not just Lake Washington. I couldn't think, although there may be a jurisdiction in Washington that doesn't have a Shoreline Management Act, you start thinking about Eastern Washington, and then you think to yourself, oh, but there's Lake Chelan, and there's Moses Lake, and there's Loon Lake up by Spokane. So we have so many lakes and rivers and protected ways throughout the state, certainly in Western Washington, but even in Eastern Washington. The Growth Management Act was adopted in 1990. I'm going to just give you a brief overview. Other people are going to address it more. It establishes a structure for comprehensive planning to ensure capital facilities, that urban growth areas are designated, and that growth occurs planned in a fashion, not haphazardly. For instance, the legislature says that we don't want things like urban sprawl, and that is defined, based on my understanding, as large single-family developments that are not close to any resources, neighborhoods with large lots that you have to drive 25 minutes to get to a grocery store. So we want to make sure that we have grocery stores where everyone can drive to them easily, if not walk to them. That's part of what the Growth Management Act wants to accomplish. And they want to make sure that there is room for everyone, not just large single-family developments, but multifamily developments and density that makes sense for cities. You think of large apartment buildings in downtown Seattle, for instance, the exact opposite of a single-family residential lot. And people prefer living in an apartment downtown. Some people love it. Some people want their single-family lot. And the goal is to plan for all of those types of living situations and make sure we have enough of each type for everyone who wants it. We have the Local Project Review Act, and this was adopted in 1995, and this was adopted in response to concerns regarding burdens and delays resulting from the increasing number of environmental laws and development requirements. So, of course, you saw earlier in the 1970s and the 1980s and the 1990s, we started adopting environmental regulations that are competing with development regulations. And it seemed like development couldn't occur. And we don't want that. We want to make sure that we are aware of our environmental concerns, that we address environmental concerns, and that development is speedily processed in this city and every city. So the Local Project Review Act helped kind of balance those interests. And then we have the Land Use Petition Act, or what we call LUPA. And this is, I'm going to talk about due process in a minute, but basically, this is what I call the Due Process for All Act. I don't know why I have my own names for these things. I guess I just do based on how I use them. And this ensures people that everyone, every developer, every neighbor to development, every city, and every person worried about the environment can appeal a final land use decision to Superior Court to hold the developer accountable, to hold the neighbor accountable, to hold the city accountable, to make sure that those final land use decisions are enacted as they are meant to be enacted. So we'll be talking about, I'd love to talk about that more because that's where I practice, but we'll move on. Nobody wants to hear about what I do every day. Procedural due process. The key elements to procedural due process are notice of what is going to happen and an opportunity to be heard. So when big projects are going to be taken on at the city, the United States Constitution and the state constitution requires the city to give all citizens due process. Usually that results in notice to affected properties and an opportunity for those people who receive that notice to come in and be heard. People submit letters about projects that are going. They come in and talk to the planning department. They talk to the developer. They have all kinds of ways to make their voice heard. It's a little confusing because not every land use decision is required to give notice. For instance, when the city issues a building permit, that is not the type of permit that they're required to give notice for. And that can be confusing to some citizens, but rest assured we are following the law and we understand frustrations when you folks come in and say that you didn't receive enough notice of something. Substantive due process focuses on the outcome of the rules. There are 4 basic questions to ask. Does the regulation have a legitimate purpose? Does the regulation appropriately accomplish that purpose? Is there a rational basis between the purpose and the regulation? Is the regulation reasonable? And is it clear and able to be understood? So without an example, what does that mean? So we say, does a regulation have a legitimate purpose? Well, we require sidewalks in certain areas of the city when you're building residential developments. Is that legitimate? Do we have a legitimate reason for requiring sidewalks along with residential development? We do. There are many of them. Just for safety, children to walk to school. Does the regulation actually connect to that purpose? Does the sidewalk actually make it safer for children to get to school. If it doesn't, then that's not an appropriate regulation. So these are the questions we asked. That I just wanted to give you a brief example, and I might be over my time. Should I wrap it up? Okay, all right. So I'll just tell you that there are takings where regulations can result in where it feels like the government has taken your property without paying you for it, and you have redress for that. It's pretty much the same as exactions and dedications. When environmental regulations go too far and you can't use your property, sometimes you have a reasonable use exception. I did touch on vesting earlier. Moratoria is when we say, hey, we're going to put a stop on development until we figure out the best thing to do for those competing interests between development and protection. And that's my conclusion. So, do I introduce my next person? Do I have my last slide? Thank you, even though I rushed it at the end. So Ted Venegas is our senior planner. He is with the Department, he's a senior planner with the Department of Commerce, supporting King and Snohomish counties. He previously served as the Land Use Review Manager in Clark County, Washington. Prior to moving to Washington, Ted managed the city of Boise's Historic Preservation Planning Program. He also has experience as a transportation planner, working for both the Idaho Department of Transportation and the Valley Regional Transit, the Regional Transit Authority for the Boise area. Ted has a master's degree in applied historic research with an emphasis on urban history from Boise State University. Thank you, Ted.
Thanks, Stephanie. So I'm relatively new to Washington. I would like to thank Adam and company for showing me around your city. That was fantastic. You have a beautiful city here. It was great getting to see a little bit of it and see some of the great planning that has occurred in the city. I'll go ahead and just give a general overview of the Growth Management Act and how it relates to planning in your community and creating your comprehensive plan and other implementing plans. So we'll generally talk about why we plan, the GMA framework, implementing the plan, and then updating the plan. So why is planning important? I think it's pretty easy to understand why planning is important. It provides some predictability and efficiency in processes that otherwise don't have that kind of predictability or efficiency. But what really, I think, is the really important part of planning and community planning is actually bringing the community together to create the plan, to help establish that plan. And part of that is, as you see here on the slide, identifying those things about your community that are important and identifying what your community needs moving forward. So at the very front of your comprehensive plan, typically you're identifying who you are as a community, the character of your community, and what your vision is and what your goals are right up front. And then the rest of the plan should kind of formulate around that vision. So the community comes together to help determine those goals and that vision. And the more robust communication you have with the community and the more robust input and participation from the community, the more legitimate the plan is to the community and the more the community takes ownership of that plan. Especially when you're in rapidly growing areas like this area, and the Puget Sound area in general, how do you move forward with growth and hold on to those values and those goals while you're going forward? Those are the important things to consider, hanging on to your sense of community. So planning, appropriate planning provides, it provides transparency and it provides predictability, as I mentioned before. So on the one side, you have development, you have developers, builders, and just a neighbor, a person in the neighborhood that maybe wants to build a fence or a shed. They need to know that the permitting process, that how they want to, what they want to do is clearly outlined, that how much is it going to cost, how long is it going to take, what is the process, and that it's all clearly outlined. And that's the transparency. And is it fair? The plan should not only provide transparency, but fairness. And is the process fair? Is what I'm doing as a developer or a builder or a person in the public the same process that this other person did? Is it fair and is it equal? And the plan should be clear, and it should provide that fairness and that transparency. On the other side, the planning process provides access to decision makers, access to public officials, access to planning staff to give your opinions on a project, either positive or negative, but it allows you to it gives a voice to the process and access to those decision makers. So between 1990 and 2010, the state of Washington grew from 4.1 million people to 6.7 million people. As somebody who moved here from a state that has less than 2 million people statewide, that is an incredible amount of people. The area, the state is expected to exceed 9 million people by 2040. That is a lot of growth. And the reasons people are moving here is obvious to me. That's the natural beauty, the recreation opportunities. It's a beautiful state. It has a lot to offer. And so it's attracting a lot of people that want to move to the area. And the Growth Management Act and planning in general is intended, as I previously indicated, to allow the community to move forward and accommodate that growth that is going to occur, whether we want it to occur or not. It's going to occur, and it allows the community to move forward with that growth and hold on to those amenities that are the reason people are moving here and the reason you live here. So allowing that growth, accommodating that growth, and protecting that natural beauty and protecting those recreation opportunities and protecting all the other amenities that this state has to offer. So the Growth Management Act, as I've already indicated, and Stephanie talked about this as well, was adopted in 1990, and it was adopted because of concerns that rapid growth in the state was occurring in a fashion that was negatively or adversely impacting those amenities that we talked about. Unsustainable growth, or sprawl, as Stephanie already talked about, was negatively impacting the natural beauty of the state, the natural resources that this state has to offer. And so the local planning is guided by this state law and regionally enforced. So the Growth Management Act acts as sort of an umbrella of laws, but as it funnels down into the local jurisdictions, it's implemented and enforced with the values of those local jurisdictions. So the state's fastest growing counties and cities are required to fully plan under the Growth Management Act, such as those in the central Puget Sound area. Fully planning counties and cities are required to meet all of the Act's goals and requirements and must agree on countywide planning policies and develop detailed comprehensive plans. Partially planning counties are the slow-growing counties in the state, and they're required to focus on critical areas and resource lands in their planning. Stephanie also talked about the planning goals. So this illustrates the 14 Growth Management Act planning goals that need to really underpin that comprehensive plan. And as Stephanie indicated, some of these have soft language. So you'll see encourage historic preservation, encourage economic development, and some of them have a little harder language, which, you know, the one highlighted in blue there, plan for and accommodate housing affordable to all economic segments. You know, previously that was encourage housing affordable to all economic segments. So the legislature changed that and changed how we address that goal in the comprehensive plan, which we'll talk more about later. And as it's already been indicated, these were never intended to be in any kind of order. So it does allow the local community to address these goals in their plans in a way that suits their local vision. So natural resource lands and critical areas really are the reason for the Growth Management Act. The preservation of these two ideas or two items. Counties must designate and conserve natural resource lands of long-term commercial significance. And counties and cities must identify, designate, and protect critical areas. And these critical areas include environmental areas, important environmental habitat areas, and they also include hazardous areas like flooding areas and geologically hazardous areas. And planning for critical areas needs to be informed by best available science. So luckily in the state of Washington, there's a lot of resources for science, for the best available science. A number of state agencies that act as resources, great universities, private organizations, and so there is a lot of resources for best available science. So that does need to be used to inform and support those critical area plans. Countywide planning policies are developed by the county in cooperation with the cities, and they ensure that plans within the county are coordinated and consistent and work together to manage regional growth. And the countywide planning policies may include a means to allocate population targets to individual cities, a mechanism for counties to designate urban growth areas, policies that address siting of public facilities that are of a regional or statewide importance, and the policies that address the need for affordable housing. In this area, you have multi-county planning policies with Snohomish County, King County, Kitsap, and Pierce counties. It operates the same way. So you have the multi-county planning policies in which all four of the counties and the jurisdictions within those counties, those plans need to be coordinated and cooperative with each other. Fully planning counties must work collaboratively with cities to designate urban growth areas. And this process includes population projections from the Office of Financial Management and regional allocation to each city, analysis of buildable land available and opportunities for contiguous and orderly development, calculation of sufficient land for 20 years of growth, and the ability of a local government to provide adequate public facilities to serve development. And the county is responsible for final decisions on urban growth areas. So counties receive a population growth projections from the Office of Financial Management, which is a generally cooperative countywide process that allocates population to cities and unincorporated urban and rural areas. In the Puget Sound region, the Puget Sound Regional Council has provided guidance based on regional geographies, allocating larger population to cities and centers. Urban areas need to contain most of the new growth and are characterized by greater density of jobs and housing, where rural areas need to maintain the rural character and are characterized by rural service levels and protection of agricultural and resource lands. So the buildable 7 counties are subject to the Buildable Lands Program. And this is really a two-part process. One is looking back to determine whether a county and its cities are achieving the urban densities within the urban growth areas as they have planned. The other part is then looking forward by determining, is there sufficient capacity for residential and employment growth over the next 20 years? And if not, the city should identify reasonable measures to accommodate that growth. So these are the required elements of a comprehensive plan, elements or chapters, if you like. The land use element is essentially the roadmap for the community's desired future growth. The other elements, housing, transportation, capital facilities, and utilities, require an inventory of what a city or a county or jurisdiction currently has, and then what is needed moving forward. And that all needs to really loop back into the land use element. So these all need to kind of loop back into each other. And those will not only have an inventory of what's existing and what's needed, but also how do you pay for it? You know, funding sources built into that as well. Counties, so the cities are required to have the top 5. The counties are required to have the 6th one, which is rural element, and that is an element that is inserted and used to protect and define that rural character. So Commerce was directed to provide housing targets by income band for each county, including permanent supportive housing, emergency housing, and emergency shelters. And this change came about with House Bill 1220. Commerce also provides recommendations for suballocating housing to cities with recommendations for the type of housing each city should be planning for to accommodate the economic group. This is likely going to show a need to relook at your zoning and to possibly rezone. You might need to rezone areas of your city to allow emergency shelters or emergency housing. You might need to look at rezoning parts of the city to allow for more density. But it's definitely going to generally require a relook at your code and relook at your zoning to accommodate these different housing targets. Commerce has developed guidance to help communities identify the types of zoning and infrastructure investment policies that have a discriminatory effect. So is there evidence of past redlining, which was a deliberate attempt to exclude people of color and prevent them from home ownership? I know as a planner, when I worked in Boise, you would look at some of these old plats, and some of the plat notes on these as planners, we've all have seen those. They're pretty disturbing when you first see them. And those are the kind of things that we're trying to remove from these planning processes. Another one is your zoning exclusionary. Is our multifamily projects and affordable housing projects, are they pushed to the fringes of your communities? Are they pushed away from amenities, away from parks, away from trails, away from access to public transportation, and away from easy access to employment? So plans must be coordinated and consistent. External consistency means that it must be consistent with multi-county planning policies or countywide planning policies and coordinated with adjacent cities and counties. Internal consistency means all elements of the plan must be based on the same future land use map and population projections. That's what I talked about with those elements. They all need to kind of circle back into each other and be based on those same projections. So each jurisdiction's code is going to have its own specific process for amending and adopting the comprehensive plan. You know, at the top, public outreach early and often, I mentioned that is really important. bringing the public in and making the public a part of the creation of the plan and giving the community ownership of the plan. So it's not just a community plan, it's the community's plan. And the more the community takes buy-in of that plan and takes ownership of the plan, the easier it is to put together and implement. Part of the process is before the plan is adopted, 60 days prior to adoption by your council, the plan does need to be submitted to the Department of Commerce for review for consistency with the Growth Management Act. This not only gives the Department of Commerce the opportunity to look at the plan, but it gives all state agencies the opportunity to take a look at the plan and make sure that the plan is up to date with their processes as well. And really, hopefully, by the time you're ready to submit that final draft to Commerce, that you've involved those critical state agencies as well along the way and had them take a look at it. The Transportation Department, Ecology, Fish and Wildlife, et cetera, having some of those state jurisdictions take a look at your plan before sending it in for that 60-day process really gives it a cleaner look by Commerce. It makes the 60-day review go a lot faster. You might get it back sooner and get it adopted sooner. So it's really important to have that process clean when you do send it up to Commerce. And Commerce has also provided a checklist as well, so that each jurisdiction is able to go through the checklist and kind of cross-check what's on the Commerce checklist with what's in your plan and make sure that you're up to date with what is being required by the GMA, by the Growth Management Act. So the main ways to implement the plan are through development regulations and spending priorities. Each jurisdiction has the flexibility to choose how to develop the comprehensive plan and how to develop implementing regulations, capital improvement plans in a way that fits your local values and vision. And as you can see here, it starts with those GMA goals. It feeds down into your countywide plans. The community vision is going along with that, and all of that feeds into your comprehensive plan and then goes into your implementation strategies. Development regulations provide predictability for developers in the community. They establish concurrency programs which ensure public facilities such as roads, water, and sewer are provided with developments they will serve. One of the, as far as zoning goes, the two main types of zoning are traditional or Euclidean zoning, which focuses more on separation of uses, minimum lot sizes, height limitations, stuff like that. Form-based codes focus more on design, physical attributes and character of development. I think the trend, I think a lot of communities are re-looking at their plans and redoing their plans and sometimes completely overhauling their zoning plans. And I think a lot of times it's more of a hybrid between the two, between the traditional zoning and the form-based zoning. So you'll have your code and it'll have a lot of images in it, a lot of pictures in it, which is good because it helps people that don't live in the plan like planners do better understand some of the requirements and what is the intent of the plan. So it's a pretty good approach. So the capital facilities element includes an inventory of the capital infrastructure and evaluates its current and future needs to accommodate projected growth. The plan also includes estimated costs of providing those facilities over the life of the plan. The transportation element also includes an inventory of a jurisdiction's transportation systems and identifies future projects as well as establishes level of service consistent with regional and state transportation plans. Concurrency programs are established in development regulations to ensure that new development will not decrease the established level of service in the comprehensive plan. So the first step in the comprehensive plan update process will be a detailed review of your existing plan and regulations. It's unlikely, that that between that 10-year, so there's a 10-year review. It's unlikely that a community is going to be able to go that 10-year period with and just make a finding of compliance with the GMA, with the Growth Management Act, because over that 10-year period, there's a lot of changes in your community. There's growth and other changes that occur in your community. There's new legislation that impacts the Growth Management Act. There's interpretations by the Growth Management Hearings Board, and there's interpretations, other legal interpretations that occur that are going to require some adjustments to your plan. Not an overhaul, but adjustments to the plan over that 10-year period. And again, Commerce provides a checklist. So Commerce provides a checklist to the communities that have all the requirements of the plan. And they also highlight in that checklist the new stuff that's come out over that last 10 years so that communities can kind of focus on the new legislation or new rules that have come out that are going to require, that will likely require some changes in the plan. And it's highly recommended that those checklists are used to cross-check your plan. And please submit those checklists as a community to Commerce when you submit your plan, because it also makes our review a lot easier. Jurisdictions failing to complete the update are ineligible for these listed grants and loans programs. So it's very important for jurisdictions to stay up to date on their comprehensive planning process. So each community has broad discretion in planning for its form and future. And this happens when people invest time to work together to ask questions such as, what is good here? What is missing? What could be better? And how do we want to provide for the growth that's likely to come and hold on to those values that we've identified as a community? In the urban areas, you might look at how you can make communities better by supporting jobs or housing near jobs. Accessible transportation to persons of all ages and abilities, and housing that supports all income levels. In the rural areas, it looks at how we can support Washington's resource lands for agriculture and forestry, protect rural character, and provide appropriate levels of service. So while the GMA does provide that overarching framework or umbrella, the local governments decide how that translates into their own desired future and how that meets their identified visions and goals. So that's it. We have a 10-minute break.
So we do have a couple of questions on the chat.
Okay.
Maybe if you can just go ahead and read them.
We have one question from the chat from Alexi. Let's say I own a plot of land next to downtown core, and the city decides to rezone from single-family residential to multi-unit, multi-story residential or commercial. Does it mean that I suddenly won the lottery as the cost of the land jumps up? How do you prevent bad actors from participating in various corruption schemes, trying to enrich on various information leaks, lobbying, etc.?
I can, Adam Weinstein, the Director of Planning and Building. Great question, Alexi. You know, I think it's a really good question, right? What happens when the upzoning like that happens? And that's something actually that we have here in the city. We have basically upzoned a lot of our city to increase housing options for folks. So in traditionally single-family neighborhoods, we now allow multiple units, housing units, to be built on those properties. So you can build ADUs and duplexes and triplexes, et cetera. I think it's a little bit unclear what the value of that upzoning is to developers. I think we've seen that in some cases, you know, very, very expensive single-family houses in that case have gotten replaced with a couple of less expensive, smaller units that don't necessarily exceed the value of single-family houses. So I'm not sure that upzoning is in all cases, you know, a big grab for a developer. But I think, you know, when the city council decides to undertake upzoning, like the example you're talking about, it's intended to promote the values of our comprehensive plan and the Growth Management Act in terms of providing more affordable housing, creating walkable communities, providing the ability for more people to live in the city. So I think we generally view things like that as a positive, and we want to encourage developers to take advantage of them. It's a good thing when developers come in and design projects like that are consistent with our comp plan. So I don't know if anybody has anything else to add.
Okay, we can ask the second question on Zoom, and then we have one in person.
This is from Bruce. Will the recently enacted Middle Housing Bill, HB 1110, be taken into consideration as part of the comp plan update process for the residential use zones? It is my understanding that cities are required to adopt ordinances in accordance with the Middle Housing Bill not later than 6 months following the adoption of the comp update plan, or be the subject to the Department of Commerce model ordinance. Thanks.
I can take that one as well. So yeah, the bill that that this question is talking about is one that actually very much is consistent with the comprehensive middle housing legislation that our city council adopted in 2020. In Kirkland, it will require basically 4 units of housing on every lot, unless you're building affordable housing or you're very close to transit, in which case you can build up to 6 units. So again, that's very, very similar to what our city council adopted. And as a matter of fact, it's so similar to the rules that we already have in place that we're one of 4 cities working on the model ordinance with the Department of Commerce that will be released to other cities who have to implement the provisions of HB 1110. So we will have to make some amendments to our code, and yeah, as the question indicated, we will have to do that within 6 months of our comprehensive plan update. So probably something like by March of 2025, we'll have to have those rules in place. But I think compared to a lot of other cities, the work that we'll have to do in Kirkland is relatively modest. We might have to tweak our parking requirements a bit. We might have to allow a little more density if folks are providing affordable housing. But generally speaking, yeah, what we have in place today is very, very consistent with HB 1110.
Hi, I'm Calvin. I have 2 questions. We can put both in. Number 1, to Stephanie's presentation. How much do model codes, like international zoning code, or model regulations, or model like codes fit into the process?
So did I understand your question? How much do,
Like model codes or model, I feel like model land use codes or model codes, how do they fit into the process?
well, I think that when we have a model code, it is something that the cities can go off of so that there is continuity throughout the state, basically, in the regions. I don't think that we have to adopt the model code per se. Yeah, I've never heard that. But I think it helps, especially new jurisdictions or jurisdictions with new employees and turnover. It helps them maintain the continuity throughout the state, know what they're doing, not get things wrong, right? They have something to go off of.
Thank you. And then my second question is, because adding up both presentations, is how much flexibility do local cities have? Like, it seems like there's almost like, not a straitjacket, but like a lot of like requirements, and like say like at the city level or the state level or county level or federal level of things to keep in mind or things to do, like mentioned off checklists has to be done. Like, as a citizen, like how valuable is it to participate in the planning process in terms of like, is there like meaningful decisions to be made, or is it like, no, like state law kind of defines what the outcome is, like there isn't really much flexibility here anyway? Like, how much policy choices are there to be made at the city level, or is it mostly defined already by federal or state laws?
Well, I will respond first, and then I'll let someone else take an answer. But yeah, the focus of my presentation was we have guidelines. They start at the top and they trickle down to us And there are some things that we can't change. And while we always want to listen to community input, there are things sometimes that unfortunately we have to tell the community, you're not going to have a say on this. But we also have many areas of discretion. And I would turn it over to our actual planners over on the right-hand side there to let you, maybe give you an example of when it's really helpful for people to come in.
I can jump in on that, and I'm Allison Zeich. I'm the Deputy Planning and Building Director, and I think it's super important for the community to get involved because, as Stephanie said, a lot of the state or even the county-wide planning policies kind of give us a sandbox. They define an area that we have to stay in the boundaries of, but we often have room that we can use to make whatever the standard is fit Kirkland to ensure that we're growing the way we want to because we're unique. And so I'm going to talk about it a little more in the latter half of the presentation, but I think that what we really work hard to do as staff is to help the community understand where you have an opportunity for input, because I know that our appointed and elected officials really value that input. So what we work to do is try to make it clear what decisions might be already kind of set or where there might be a hard kind of guideline, and where there's opportunity for input and where we still have a chance to make a certain regulation, like how 4 units on one lot looks or feels in Kirkland. So that's what we try to help the community work through.
It's like most aesthetic things, like how it looks. Is that what we're saying, like color and stuff, or?
It would be different depending on what exactly type of thing we're looking at. And so in Kirkland, with the example I just used, like 4 units per lot, we still have the authority to regulate how much of the lot is covered in hardscape, how much square footage is allowed on the lot. We have local ordinances that guide tree retention, for example. So there's still a lot of opportunities to sort of individualize it to our city.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Like concrete example is very good.
There is one more question here in person.
This is for Adam, I think. Ted mentioned Puget Sound Regional Council quick, but maybe you could talk through what MPOs are and the fact that they're federally mandated, and maybe talk through what your experience was like working with Puget Sound Regional Council for the recent growth designation for downtown.
Yeah, so these metropolitan planning thanks. Thanks. The metropolitan planning agencies that you're talking about are primarily, I think were primarily created to ensure that cities are planning land use around transportation adequately on a regional basis, right? And that cities are working together, that it's not just a city operating by itself and growing a lot and not thinking about how its growth affects other cities or how people are moving through the region from their city to get to other destinations. And so, yeah, the Puget Sound Regional Council is our agency that is authorized under federal law that encourages the coordination of cities within a big region, right? So that's super important in the Puget Sound region where we're having huge growth pressures, right? And lots of job growth and housing affordability crises and lots of environmental resources in this relatively confined area. And so we work really closely with PSRC where our elected officials are involved in their executive boards, helping them make decisions on behalf of the entire region. And we worked with them recently on our Greater Downtown Urban Center designation. So we are getting our Greater Downtown, which is what we can consider our historic downtown in Moss Bay, plus the station area plan around I-405 and Northeast 85th Street, designating that a Greater Downtown to recognize all the great planning principles that are implemented there, walkable neighborhoods, housing diversity, open space protection, et cetera. And then also so we can have a better chance of getting transportation funding for that area to build the infrastructure that will help accommodate all the growth there. And so I would say, yeah, we're very much partners with PSRC. We work really closely with them. They help us out. We work really well with them to do things like designate the Urban Growth Center.
And we have one more question on the chat, and then we will take a quick break.
This question comes from Lisa. Is an elected city council member allowed to partake in consulting projects through their own consulting agency for city projects when planning for growth? Thank you.
I'm going to let the other city attorney answer that.
Hi, I'm Darcy Eilers. I'm the assistant city attorney, so I am also later in the presentation. Could you repeat the question just so I know I understood it?
Is an elected city council member allowed to partake in consulting projects through their own consulting agency for city projects when planning for growth?
I'll try to answer the question. So all agencies, well, all cities, including ours, have codes of ethics for elected officials. And Kirkland's is adopted by municipal code. And there's state laws about ethics for elected officials and what actions they can take in relation to the government that they serve. And so to the extent an elected official is a member of, say, an organization or a company that provides construction services, that construction company can't bid on city projects. It might be a bad one, actually, because we have to do low bids. But they couldn't serve as like an architect for the city because that would be a conflict of interest between the city and the elected official. And so they couldn't, for example, have the elected official's business, if they have a direct financial interest in that business, in that transaction, they couldn't serve as, say, our comp plan advisory consultant that was developing the comp plan with the city, with city staff. And their business couldn't put in and wouldn't be selected because of conflict of interest rules. If somebody doesn't have a financial interest in something, then they could. So if somebody's like a board member on a nonprofit and the nonprofit is providing input to the community, that isn't a conflict of interest because there's no financial interest. So we're not talking about that later. That's a really good question, though. But it is part of sort of like open government related. It's just not part of my presentation later, but it's a great question about how there can be conflicts, and there's a lot of state laws and local laws that work to prevent that.
Okay, so there will be other opportunities for asking questions. We'll take a brief 5-minute break and be back at 7:25. Presenting the Kirkland 2044 Comprehensive Plan Update, Janice Swinson.
Thank you. Good evening. So for my portion of the presentation, I'll go over a little bit about our comprehensive plan, our community engagement goals and objectives for the 2044 Comprehensive Plan Update, and our overall process. So one thing, as I'm starting this process, I think about where we were back when we updated the last comprehensive plan. If you think back 2015, we were creating, in 2013 to 15, we were creating plans in the Totem Lake area and also downtown, our downtown plan, about looking forward to 2035. And so if you look back at what has happened, we've really implemented many of those plans that we created back with the last update, such as redevelopment of the village at Totem Lake Park, creating infrastructure in the Totem Lake area, and in the downtown Kirkland urban, creating mixed-use, livable, walkable places. We have the Cross Kirkland Corridor pedestrian and bike trail. We envisioned that. We have a master plan for that that's getting implemented, and now we can walk and bike on that trail from, Bellevue through Kirkland all the way up to Totem Lake. So that's the sort of thing we need to think about for the future. We've also amended our codes, as you've heard, to allow a range of housing types, duplexes, cottages, and more flexible accessory dwelling units in our low-density residential areas. And also around us, our regional transit system is in the process of being constructed, And we are looking at how we can link up to those transportation hubs and within Kirkland, and then also regionally. We are also updating our transportation master plan along with the comprehensive plan. So for this update, we've created a logo that we feel really represents who we are as a community and who we want to become. This logo expresses our values of wanting to be a belonging community where everyone feels they belong, whether you live and work in Kirkland or visit Kirkland, and also connected, how we can best connect with our community by studying and improving how people get around Kirkland, whether you walk, bike, roll, drive, and connect as people. Also, we want to be a sustainable community, a sustainable city, protecting the environment and natural resources, reducing gas emissions, recycling programs, and an advocate for green building and a thriving local economy. We want to be welcoming. We feel we are welcoming, and we want to welcome everyone in our community and our future community members, people of all incomes, to provide support and services to a diversity of community members. We have, for this update, we have selected these key themes that will be interwoven throughout our comprehensive plan policies and our community engagement goals. We have them listed here: advance diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, sustainability, housing options for all and housing affordability, mobility connections to regional transit, and also accessibility for all people to get to those locations. Resiliency, how we handle future emergencies, pandemic response, economic and fiscal planning, and smart city initiatives, being smarter about how we handle our transportation, mobility, and infrastructure, digital transformation, and so on. And we also, City Council has some specific goals that they have for us and that we will incorporate into the comprehensive plan policy update. So as you heard earlier, there are certain chapters of the comprehensive plan that are mandated and some are optional. These are the different chapters of the comprehensive plan, and the comprehensive plan is available. You can on the city's website. You can just type in comprehensive plan, and you can scroll down to the different chapters, and you can also do that with the zoning code as well. So these are different topic areas that have policies for the how we manage growth in the city. And there are different departments where we are coordinating closely with staff and other departments too. We also have 13 neighborhood plans which describe, they have unique policies that and priorities for that are unique to each neighborhood. And we have been updating those on a regular basis over the last few years. We are looking at having a new update cycle that will be, instead of each year, we will look at the neighborhood plan update with our next major comprehensive plan update in 10 years. That said, there are two neighborhoods that we have not done a deep dive in with working with the community since they were annexed to the city from King County in 2011, and those are Juanita and Kingsgate neighborhoods. Our goal is to start working with those neighborhood associations on updating their neighborhood plans as soon as we have the staff resources to do that. So we're looking at starting that this year with completion with the final adoption of the comp plan in 2024. So let's see. We are looking at doing a scan and making minor text and policy changes to the neighborhood plans to meet recommendations from a report that was prepared it did a equity review of many of our policies in the comprehensive plan and made suggested recommendations for policy changes. That report is on our K2444 Comprehensive Plan Update webpage. Let's see here. So as far as Kirkland's growth targets go, we have, this chart talks about our allocation or our shared responsibility for planning for jobs and housing for the next 20 years. We are looking at an additional 13,200 housing units that we need to plan for. And as far as jobs, an additional 26,490 jobs. Let's see, so we need to, majority of those jobs and housing goals, targets are planned for the Northeast 85th Street sub-area and our Totem Lake Urban Center. So we have applied to the Puget Sound Regional Council to be designated, as Adam mentioned, I believe, to be designated as a regional growth center in the greater downtown area. So that would include the downtown area, some portions of Moss Bay and Everest, and then the Northeast 85th Street station area plan. And that's really planning for this growth center to be around the Puget Sound, or the Sound Transit bus rapid transit stop at Northeast 85th Street and I-405 by 2026. And the goal with the station area plan, the vision for that area is very similar to, say, Totem Lake, or Totem Lake would be a good example, to create more of a walkable district with higher tech, higher wage jobs, affordable housing, new park amenities, and other commercial uses linked by transit. The regional center designation, we've applied to PSRC, and in June, we're hoping that the executive board, that at the executive board meeting for PSRC, that they will make that final designation for the area. So the goal of being designated as a regional growth center is to plan for higher density and employment density surrounded by transit. And also, if with that designation, we'd be able to qualify for federal dollars for capital infrastructure and transportation projects. So one of the things we will be doing is making sure that we meet our policies and our amendments, meet the new Growth Management Act and legislative requirements that you heard about, and the Washington State Department of Commerce. They kind of review all of the county and city updates and make sure they're consistent. We need to make sure that we're consistent with the Puget Sound Regional Vision 2050 growth strategies for the Puget Sound area, and also the King County countywide planning policies. There are also other government agencies that we need to make sure that we are consistent with: Sound Transit, King County Metro Transit, and utility companies, water districts, and other East Side cities. So we try and meet with them when we can, and to be sure we're being consistent. So this graphic really shows our update process. Our zoning code, there's a chapter in the zoning code that talks about our procedures and requirements for updating both the comprehensive plan and zoning code. We need to make sure we comply with the state statutes. We are going to be looking at this. We had an equity review report prepared, and also we have our adopted Kirkland Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging 5-year roadmap that was adopted. So we're going to be reviewing all of our policies with those recommendations in mind and making revisions. We have a public outreach and engagement plan that we have, and we've begun many activities about that. I'll go into that in just a minute. We will be having Planning Commission and other boards and commission study sessions. And also, we need to comply with the State Environmental Policy Act. You heard about that. Whether or not we're still evaluating whether the extent of the changes need an environmental impact statement or a supplemental EIS or just an addendum to the last comprehensive plan update we did. We are definitely, based on our community engagement and comments that we receive from the community, that will influence the policy changes that are made as well. We will be having a the Planning Commission will be holding a public hearing on the draft plan, ideally in April. And then we need to, as you heard from Ted, we need to give a 60-day notice. We need to send the draft plan to the State Department of Commerce to make sure that we're complying with the requirements, and they will give us feedback on that. And then the final step is City Council makes a decision on the final plan based on a Planning Commission recommendation. And that is required to, ideally that will be in the fall, and but we're required by the state to complete this update by December 2024. So Allison will talk a little bit more about everybody's role in this process, but the staff's role is really to work on intergovernmental coordination, interdepartment coordination. We have staff teams set up with representatives from each department, with the senior planners being the lead on coordinating those things. We need to, and we will be, and we are now, we have been listening to the community's feedback and their comments on what they want to see, the vision for the future of the city. And we will be revising our policies with those, including those comments and those regulatory requirements. And we need to comply with our zoning code process requirements and with a final decision by City Council. So the community's role is really, we encourage everyone to participate in our process and let us know what you think. Provide us with written or oral comments to the boards and commissions, and attend public meetings, and get others involved. This is a photo of the town hall on bikes we did last month with middle school and high school students, trying to encourage everyone to bike more and also ride their bikes to school. It was really a fun event. We've been working also with students from a couple of the high schools, Juanita and Lake Washington High School too, on class projects, so that's been great. So some of our community engagement goals, we're trying to conduct an equitable and inclusive community engagement process. We want to increase the involvement from priority populations that are shown on the screen. We've been really working hard to reach out for people that may not have been involved in the past process or not usually involved in our policy and code amendment processes. We want to reach out to stakeholders who want to live in Kirkland and maybe can't afford to. We want to make sure that the involvement is meaningful and resonates the participants' values. We want to make sure people feel heard and understood and know how their input will be used. And we want to really educate people about their role in government. So we're trying to do a really hard, do a lot of that. We want to make sure that people participate as much as they can And we're really working hard at building relationships, trust, and respect between the city and priority populations. And we want to do this so that we create Kirkland as a stronger, more vibrant, and more inclusive community. So this is a good illustration of where we are now. It's May and June. We had a kickoff visioning event looking at asking the community what they want to see for their vision for Kirkland in a lot of different topic areas. We have taken that information and we've started drafting a revised vision statement that we will start sharing with. We've shared it with the Planning Commission. We'll share it with City Council in July. And we'll put a draft copy up on the K2044 website as well. So we're doing these waves of different community engagement opportunities for these different topic areas. So right now we're working on housing and human services, those two elements. And how we have next, in July and August, we'll work on city services, and September, October, economic development. So during these different waves, we have established, or we are establishing focus groups for those specific topic areas. We're reaching out to priority populations with a focus of getting them involved. If anyone is interested in joining a focus group, they can contact me, and you have my information there. We will have surveys on the different topic areas. We'll have different meetings with the community members. If you're interested in having us come do a presentation to one of your organizations, we'd be happy to do that. You'll see us at the farmers market and other community events to share information about how people can get involved in the process. And let's see here. So the different phases of the update, really we're in the focus of now during 2023 until September, and really all through the process, is our major push on community engagement. And we have begun to, we've done our review checklist, and we've started, staff has started working on revised policies for the different elements based on the community feedback we've received. And the goal will be to have a good draft plan by, say, early next year, 2024. We have a tentative public hearing scheduled in April with the Planning Commission, and then ideally we'll have a final decision by City Council in fall of 2024. So these are the ways that we're encouraging people to get involved. There's you can go to kirklandwa.gov/K2044 for all the information we have, and we'll continue to update that. There's a tab where you can sign up for email to receive email alerts about upcoming events or public meetings. We'll put surveys. We have surveys up there that you can take that are quick surveys, 5 to 10 minutes, just real quick. You can join a focus group. And we also have, you can send us your thoughts or comments or questions to an email address. It's 2044 comprehensive plan at kirklandwa.gov. And we'd be happy to meet with your organization or your representative too as well. So with that, anybody have any questions on that? Okay, I'm going to turn it over now to Allison Zeich, who's up next presenting the roles and responsibilities of planning. Allison is a Deputy Director of Planning and Building with the City of Kirkland, Washington. She's leading our long-range planning team on Kirkland's large-scale policy and planning projects. Prior to working with the city's long-range planning division, Allison spent 6 years in Planning and Building Department's current planning group, doing development review for residential and commercial projects and providing public information at the planning counter. Allison has a Master of City and Regional Planning from Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo, and a Bachelor of Science in Community and Regional Development from the University of California, Davis. Go, Allison.
Thanks, Janice. And thank you so much to everyone for joining us tonight. I'm sure you all had long days, and to come sit in a 3-hour class is quite a commitment. So really appreciate those of you in chambers and those of you online as well. Feel free to get up and stretch around if anyone needs a break while I'm talking here. So I get to go over some of the roles and responsibilities in the planning process. In the interest of time and knowing that we can send this, this deck out to all of you, right? I'll try to kind of just provide the Kirkland context and try to leave a lot of time for questions at the end. So I think you've already heard a lot about how many different people planning involves. So a whole range of participants, and we're going to go over some of the people that are primarily involved in the process here in Kirkland. So we've got elected officials, planning commission, staff, hearing examiners, other appointed bodies, in our case in Kirkland that involves working with other commissions like the Transportation Commission, the Senior Council, the Youth Council, all kinds of fun folks. Most importantly, it involves the public and then stakeholders as well. And we're going to take a little bit of time to dive a little deeper into each of those. There's 3 types of planning decisions. I've got them on the screen now, but I'm not going to talk about them till a little bit later. And so the main kind of 3 buckets of folks involved in the planning process that we're going to talk about tonight are elected. So that's in Kirkland, that's our city council. So they're our policymakers. And then we have our planning commission. So those are appointed officials. They're our policy advisors. And then you have professional planning staff. We get hired and we administer the policy. And we're going to take a little bit of time to talk about each of those in detail. So first up, we have our elected officials. So that's the city council and the mayor. And in the context of tonight, I'm going to talk mostly about how they're just involved in the planning process. So our elected officials, our city council in Kirkland, they're our legislative body. So they're the final decision maker on our policies and our regulations and also on funding. So important. And one of their, well, of course, I'm a planner, so I think this, but of course, one of their most important jobs is to appoint our planning commissioners. Our planning commissioners do a ton of work in Kirkland, so we really appreciate the thoughtful decisions that council makes to appoint those planning commissioners. We're going to go over city council obligations, and again, this is specific to the planning process here in Kirkland. And I like to think about it really about how our city council supports the work of the planning commission and how they interface with the planning commission, because it is sort of a back and forth relationship. It's a 2-way street or 2-way bike lane. So first, they respect and they support the planning commission's role. They appoint people to the planning commission. They review the recommendations of the planning commission. And in the case of our city council, sometimes that's when the 2-way bike lane starts, right? They might have questions of the planning commission about their recommendations. They might have comments. They might transmit information about the ultimate decision they make back to our planning commission. So there's 2-way communication. Sometimes they agree with the planning commission. I think our city council often agrees with great recommendations from the planning commission, but sometimes they don't, and it's not their job to agree with the planning commission all the time. But they do take time to explain the why, and our council is really great at that. And so that often happens in public meetings as the council is making their decisions. They do often take time, individual council members, to explain why they're making the decision they're making and how that might fit into the context of what Planning Commission recommended. We've talked a lot about 2-way bike lanes already. And then the other important thing that City Council does is they do adopt the planning work program. So that really directs the work of Planning Commission and also a lot of our work as well as staff. So they're kind of providing us that long-term picture. This is what we want you to work on. Importantly, too, on a lot of our bigger projects, early in the process, our City Council is providing us with policy direction. So they're kind of giving us the guidelines of this is the general direction we want this change in code to go, or they're setting the themes for our comp plan update. And so that really gives the Planning Commission a good idea of sort of where the boundaries are of what they're working on, what the questions are that City Council wants them to answer in their recommendation to City Council. And of course, that informs a lot of our staff work as well. So now our Planning Commission, and these are our policy advisors. So again, a little biased, but 7 of my favorite folks to work with in the city. So these are appointed officials in the city. And they are community members, they are volunteers, and they do, like I said, just a lot of work. We give them a lot of work to do in Kirkland. We keep them very busy. And ultimately, their responsibility is to provide recommendations on code amendments, on policy amendments to the city council. And so in Kirkland, our Planning Commission advises on legislative matters. In some jurisdictions, they might make quasi-judicial decisions, and we'll talk about that in a second. And I loved Commerce had this statement, but I'm going to start adopting it. That Planning Commission is our fact-finding body, which is really a cool way to think about it. So the way that they're kind of our fact-finding body is that Planning Commission is often holding really in-depth study sessions on specific matters, and those are held in public sessions. So they're open to the community, and that's where staff and Planning Commission are working together to present information to get to that ultimate recommendation. And again, we do that with the community, so they're taking public comment during those study sessions and synthesizing kind of what they're hearing from the community. The other thing they do is they often hold the public hearings. So this is an official part of the process that's required to hold a public hearing in the legislative process, and Planning Commission is most often the body that holds the official public hearing, so they're building the official record and taking the public testimony in before it gets transmitted to City Council along with the Commission's recommendation. Planning Commission has some obligations too. And so first they, of course, support the council's role, so they're often, like we talked about, City Council is providing us with that kind of high-level directional guidance. Planning Commission is figuring out this is the direction we have to go, but this is kind of the specifics of how we recommend you get there. Another obligation from Planning Commission, I've already alluded to it. We give them a lot of homework, so we're often providing them with a lot of information before they step into a meeting to talk about it in front of the entire community and available via recording afterwards. So they do their homework, they read the packet before the meetings. Planning Commission, it's an obligation, but I'm gonna, since we're talking about Kirkland specifically, I'm just gonna say that our Planning Commission does give careful consideration and weight to all public testimony. We watch them do that at least twice a month, sometimes more. They do it in front of the community. And our Planning Commission is great, and they ask a lot of questions of the community as well. Planning Commission is also obligated to have an open mind, treat all parties with due respect. There's several kind of formal things they have to do in public hearings, so certain formalities following Robert's Rules of Order or parliamentary procedure. Planning Commission does give appropriate deference to staff's technical recommendations, so often with our professional judgment, we're making a recommendation to Planning Commission. They're considering that and weighting it appropriately as they deliberate on their recommendation to City Council. And like we talked about, City Council doesn't always necessarily agree with Planning Commission's recommendations or not with all of Planning Commission's recommendations. So, of course, part of Planning Commission is understanding that it's not City Council's obligation to agree with 100% of their recommendation. And so, again, I'm going to just keep giving the Kirkland context. Why our Planning Commission is effective in Kirkland. They have an annual work plan. We actually do 3-year work programs for our Planning Commission here, but it does get updated every year. They have good communication with council. So they often or sometimes do joint meetings with City Council, and then staff also helps transmit recommendations and feedback between the two bodies. They're prepared. They use their staff resources well. And of course, our Planning Commission welcomes a lot of public involvement. They do that formally at public meetings, during items from the audience, or by collecting testimony during public hearings. They also do it informally. Their email addresses are on our website, and I know that the community contacts them directly often as well. I think we covered a lot of that already. Our Planning Commission also has a chairperson, and so they're sort of the captain of the ship during planning commission meetings. So they're running the meeting efficiently, making sure that everyone's treated fairly in those meetings, particularly when it's items from the audience or during a public hearing when we're collecting public testimony. They keep us on time. As you'll imagine, after you get to the end of this 3-hour class, a 4th hour would be difficult. And so our chairperson is often keeping us on track of time and making sure that we're running through things efficiently. If something's not quite ready, if the planning commission isn't ready to make a decision quite yet, the chair, for example, might say, hey, let's table this to the next meeting when it's not 10 o'clock at night and we have a little bit more bandwidth. Now, planning staff's obligations. And any of the electeds or appointeds in the room can chime in if I've missed one of our obligations. And so we say planning staff on this slide, but really when we're working on code amendments or policy amendments in Kirkland, it involves a lot more than the planning staff. So we often talk to our building staff if we're amending something that's related to the building code. We talk to our public works staff a whole lot, especially our transportation staff. We talk to, our park staff, our human services staff. I mean, we really work, it involves everyone. The comp plan in particular is a great example of a project where even though the planning department and Janice are leading that project, we're literally working with every department in the city. So it's fun stuff. In my opinion, our most important obligation is seeking the public input, so that second bullet point there. So we work really hard to do that. Janice gave some great examples of how we work to do that. But that's a big part of our job, is making sure the community's involved in the process, making sure they understand how to be involved in the process, and then making sure that we're transmitting what we learn to Planning Commission and City Council. I talked already a little bit about that staff makes recommendations to our decision-making bodies. So we do that using our professional judgment. And then another thing that we do on a day-to-day basis is we implement what we've adopted. So we do that when we review building permits or land use decisions. We do it at the counter when someone comes in with questions. And then we also sometimes have to enforce regulations, and we do that with our code enforcement team. And so, again, on the kind of reverse, City Council and Planning Commission have some obligations to staff. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to throw it up on the screen and then move on to the types of decisions that... Oh, look, there's more obligations of planning staff.
Never ending, really.
That's why we love our job, though. Every day is different, truly. And so I talked already about how we make recommendations to decision-making bodies based on our professional judgment. We also do that by collecting information from what other comparable jurisdictions are doing. We do it based on what we've learned from the community. We do it from best available science or best practices that we've gathered from other places. And again, this is another point I already talked on. Often staff is sort of responsible for transmitting messages between decision-making bodies. So we might transmit the Planning Commission recommendation to the City Council. Sometimes Planning Commission joins us in that, but that is one of our responsibilities. And then, of course, we respect and support the decisions of the decision makers. And then another big one is providing responsive, complete, and timely answers to questions. And so I can't remember what they told me in planning school, but when you write a staff report and you think you've provided all the important information to Planning Commission, often we haven't yet, right? They might have questions we haven't thought of. They might want additional information before they make a decision. So it's really important for planning staff to be responsive to that. So answer those additional questions they have. If they want us to dig deeper, we dig deeper. If they want us to check what other comparable cities are doing, it's our responsibility to go chase down that information. And also to provide them with that information in a timely manner, right? They have to make really important decisions. They're serving a very important role in the community, and so it's our job to support them in that. So giving them the information when they need it, and making sure that it's the information they asked for, and that we've done our best to provide as much information as we can. I'm going to add another point to that, which is providing the information in a way that's easy to understand. And we're always working to improve that. Another person that's involved in planning processes is the hearing examiner. So the hearing examiner is typically a neutral third party, and they would be involved in quasi-judicial activities. So that might be a land use decision that's evaluating whether or not a proposal meets the adopted rules and regulations for the city. So this often occurs for sort of larger scale projects, not necessarily day-to-day projects like building permits. This is often something like large planned unit developments or school master plans, things like that. So also code enforcement cases. So that's how we use a hearing examiner in Kirkland, very briefly. And here's where we're talking a little bit more about land use planning decisions. So we've talked a lot about legislative decisions. So that's what I was talking about. Code amendments, policy amendments, those are legislative decisions. That's kind of making the rules. And so Planning Commission and City Council are both involved in that. And then we have a couple different types of decisions that are more applying the rules. And that's one of the ways is quasi-judicial decisions that I just touched on briefly. And then another way is, or another decision, sorry, are administrative decisions. So those are the day-to-days really. That's making sure that we're applying the zoning codes accurately to building permit reviews. It could be looking at short plats. It could be approving fences. I mean, everything. That's just applying the rules. We do that on a daily basis, and that's mostly administrative, so it's happening at the staff level. And so just a little bit more on the typical steps in the legislative process. Again, that's making the rules. So zoning code, comprehensive plan, subdivision title, a lot of the things that Stephanie and Ted both talked about. So in Kirkland, the typical steps in that process are a change is proposed, and that could be initiated in several different ways in Kirkland. Sometimes staff's noticed something that we think needs to change. A lot of times that change might be directed by our city council, or maybe planning commission has brought up something that they've heard from the community. Hey, we really need to look at our accessory dwelling unit regulations because we heard that there's sort of a barrier to people building these things. So what can we do to clean up the code to make them a little bit easier to implement? One example that planning commission's talked about really recently. Next step would be staff takes on that project and we start reviewing it, doing a lot of the research to provide all that great information. We hope it's great information to planning commission and city council. There's always public involvement, so not only a public hearing, but depending on the project, we identify who we need to talk to. A lot of times it's really broad-based. Sometimes there might be more specific stakeholders that we want to reach out to in the process. Ultimately, we're making a recommendation to Planning Commission on what that code or policy amendment should be. And there's a public hearing held, and that public hearing is the record of public testimony. Planning Commission typically holds that public hearing. They would deliberate on the decision, and they would ultimately make a recommendation to City Council. City Council, you should adopt this policy change. This is how it should read. It's a simplification, but that's high level how it goes. And then City Council reviews it. They do that in an open meeting. Often because the public hearing has been held at Planning Commission, there's not a public hearing involved, but community members still have a way to contact City Council before they make their final decision. City Council makes that final decision. We adopt that change, whether it's a policy change or a code change, and there's often an opportunity for that to be appealed. It doesn't happen very often. This is the most exciting part, talking about public participation, and Janice talked about it a lot already, so I'll try to be brief and she can kick me behind the dais if I'm going on about it, because it really is, I think, one of, if not the most important things that we do as planning staff. And so when we're talking about public engagement or public participation in the planning process, we're talking about all community members, and that's anyone that lives, works, plays, learns in Kirkland. And it's really important to stress that everyone has valuable input, no matter their technical expertise, no matter their educational background, how long they've lived in Kirkland, if they even live in Kirkland, maybe they just work in Kirkland, but we feel like everyone has valuable input. And we really seek to find the different perspectives and to find the people we maybe haven't heard from yet. And then I mentioned that sometimes, depending on the type of project we're working on, we might reach out to very specific stakeholders. So that could be the development community if we're changing something about how tall elevator overruns can be. Sorry, it's just the example I have on top of mind right now. So we might reach out to a builder to learn more about specific requirements for elevators on rooftops. I'm sorry, I couldn't think of a more exciting example. Often we might be reaching out to the environmental community. So when we updated our shoreline master plan that Stephanie was talking about earlier, we're reaching out to some specific stakeholders involved in that. It could be the environmental community, scientists to get best available science. It could be people that own properties on the shoreline, and then also the business community. So if we're looking at the Moss Bay neighborhood plan, for example, we're reaching out to the downtown business community to make sure that the plan and the policies work for the business community as well as residents. So just a few examples. And every project try to identify who do we really need to talk to, who do we need to seek out. I've got just a couple slides on public hearings. So I've mentioned this several times. Public hearings are really the official record that are required in any legislative process to adopt code amendments or policy amendments in Kirkland. And the public hearing is really about collecting that public testimony. So Kirkland specific items here for our public hearings. We do welcome anyone to speak at public hearings. The Planning Commission procedures in Kirkland do limit their speaking time to 3 minutes. That helps us with efficiency. The chair can extend speaking time. And they can also arrange the order of speakers so that the testimony is in logical groupings. So for example, if we've got a code amendment and we've got some people that really, really love the code amendment and some people that don't quite agree with the code amendment, the chair might decide, hey, can we hear from everyone that is kind of on the pro side first, everyone on the con side after, so that if it's going to help the commissioners kind of synthesize their thought through the process. So everyone can talk, but we can kind of arrange how people present that information. In Kirkland, we also typically allow people to make small presentations if you've got some visuals. And then this is more specific to kind of planning commissioners in a public hearing. Our planning commissioners are really great at helping people through the public hearing process. So sometimes, and it's always my favorite when someone shows up and they said, hey, I've never participated before, but I'm here. I care about this issue. I'm going to make a public comment. Our planning commissioners are always really great about kind of helping that person through, waiting it out if maybe they have little nerves, they need to take a breath. So that's always really fun. Our planning commissioners also sort of respectfully and fairly, I think, accept public testimony no matter what they're hearing. Sometimes people are really invested in something. Emotions can run high. So our planning commissioners remain patient and respectful of everyone's views. And then we get to decision making. And so this is just sort of some guidelines for that deliberation and decision process. So I've mentioned how our planning commissioners and city council members do this already. A lot of times they're not just saying yay or nay on a project, they're also providing comment on the record in front of the community about why they're making that decision. And sometimes there's discussion amongst them that kind of helps them find consensus, and then through parliamentary procedure, there's often official motions that have to be made to get to that recommendation. You'll often, if you've ever watched a planning commission meeting, hear sometimes staff might have questions wanting to clarify a decision that's been made. So planning commission and city council will also clarify sometimes for us to make sure that we're noting it correctly so that we can, for example, transmit the planning commission recommendation to city council accurately. This is about building the record. I think I've talked about a lot of these points already, so I'm going to move on in the interest of time, and I think I get to introduce our next speaker now. Right, holding questions for the end? Excellent. So next up is Darcy Eilers, our Assistant City Attorney with the City of Kirkland, City of Kirkland. Darcy advises on most areas of municipal law, including open government and public records, what I believe we're talking about tonight.
Darcy serves as a member of the Washington State Association of Municipal Attorneys Amicus Committee, which participates in selected appellate cases affecting Washington cities and towns. After graduating from the University of Washington School of Law, Darcy clerked at the Washington Court of Appeals, Division I, and served as a staff attorney at the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. Thanks, Darcy.
All right, no one else has lowered this, but I am going to. There we go. All right. And I'll apologize in advance if I start coughing. It's not what I was sick earlier last weekend, and I didn't even have a cough when I was sick, so it's because of the mask that I'm wearing. It dries my mouth out. So I'll try to take a quick drink before I start coughing. And since I have the podium, I'll make a quick clarification because lawyers always like to think about questions too long, and someone asked earlier about an ethics question, and I realized that I answered very broadly that someone couldn't contract, their business couldn't have a contract with the city, but in fact it's sort of, they can't have an interest in a contract that they oversee or could make a decision on. So for example, I wanted to say this so we don't discourage people. If you're here and thinking about participating in local government, being an elected official, being on a planning commission, that won't prohibit you from having a business that contracts with the city, because lots of you will never make decisions on contracts that the city engages in. So even city council doesn't have the authority to vote on contracts that are low dollars or things like that. So anyway, you can still be on planning commissions and still have your business. So, okay. Open government, that is what I get to talk to you about today. And I'll start with what Allison did, which was, you're welcome to stand up because we don't have another break before the end. So if you feel like you want to stand up and move around while I'm talking, that is fine. I'm going to do a quick background about why we have open government. Then we're going to talk about the Open Public Meetings Act and the Public Records Act, and a quick last slide about records retention at the end, which isn't on my list. But so one of the reasons, I don't know how many of you are here because you're on one of our commissions or an elected official. I know that some of you are. So one of the requirements of open government laws are that you become trained, that you are trained on the OPMA and public records for public records officers, statewide and local government officials. The City of Kirkland's public records officers are regularly training, but for local government officials, you need a refresher training 90 days after you take office, no later than 90 days, and then every 4 years after. So this training that I'm doing satisfies that requirement. So don't forget to get your credit that Ted pointed out on this website for the Department of Commerce, or maybe Prince did. So open government, a quick overview of that before we dive into the two different laws that are open government related. They're often called sunshine laws. That's what people call them in Washington a lot. There's a sunshine committee that reviews these at the legislative level. And one of the reasons for these is that transparency builds public confidence in government. And we can relate a lot of this. The reason I think that Department of Commerce recommends that these two get tied together is we want the public to have confidence in the decisions the cities are making about planning. And so these two last quotes are from the OPMA, which is our first one, but I thought they also apply sort of to the idea of the Public Records Act, that the people in delegating authority do not give public servants the right to decide what is good for the people to know and what it is not good for them to know. That essentially the public should be able to know everything, to know if their public officers are making the right decisions. Okay, so the Open Public Meetings Act. You've been hearing a lot about meetings, and the Open Public Meetings Act governs all of those meetings, Planning Commission and the City Council. And this is the big picture of the OPMA. That's what we call it, the OPMA. You'll hear me say that. All meetings of the governing body of a public agency shall be open and public, and all persons shall be permitted to attend any meeting of governing body of a public agency. Any action taken at a meeting that is in violation of the OPMA is null and void. That doesn't mean that the same decision can't be made later to fix the problem, but at that point in time that it's realized the meeting was in violation, it is null and void. I mean, it was null and void before, and you have to sort of take actions to fix it. So any member of a governing body who attends a meeting knowing it violates the OPMA is subject to personal liability of their $500, and then if you keep doing $1,000. So there's consequences to violating them, and someone who recognizes an OPMA violation and files suit against them gets awarded costs and attorney's fees in court. That's the big picture. So this has like no info because I really wanted to point out that a meeting is very simple. Action and a quorum of the people who make decisions. That's really what a meeting is. It doesn't have to be where everyone sits up at the dais and you know it's a meeting. It can be lots of different things, so people have to take care. Action, and maybe you can read that little funny comic that I found. Action is the transaction of official business. So it doesn't just include final action, which is often what we think about, sort of the vote at the end. That's final action, but action for purposes of defining a meeting is public testimony, deliberations, discussions, considerations, reviews, and evaluations. Those are all sort of things that are defined in the OPMA as that. So the thing that action isn't is the passive receipt of information. So staff might send city council or the planning commission their email with everything that they want them to review or send out the packet to them for their meetings. That isn't the meeting itself. If somebody started replying all, which is we prevent that in Kirkland and most agencies do, then it would become a meeting if people started talking about it. But the passive receipt of information is not a meeting. So all the council members can be on an email chain, for example, together, but as long as they're just receiving information from staff only. Okay. What is a public agency? And for purposes of time, I'll save it. I mean, Kirkland is a public agency. This is a Department of Commerce slide that wants you to know there's lots of them that are public agencies. The one that's important here, other than cities, is sub-agencies created by legislation. So the Planning Commission of the City of Kirkland is a public agency governed by the OPMA, as is the Civil Service Commission. That's a creature of, it's required by statute. And so those are considered public agencies covered by the OPMA. A little bit more about that sort of governing body: multi-member board, commission, committee, council, or policy or rulemaking body, or any committee of a public agency when the committee acts on behalf of the governing body, conducts hearings, or takes testimony or public comment. So we have some advisory boards that are not technically covered by the OPMA. We still run their meetings like their OPMA meetings because we want to be fully transparent, but they wouldn't legally be required because they can't take any action. The Civil Service Commission acts on behalf of the city in making its decisions. The Planning Commission does the public hearing aspects of the city's work. The City Council can also have those public hearings, but that is one of their works, so they are covered by the OPMA. Not all, if you're from another place that doesn't run all of its advisory boards as an OPMA meeting, that wouldn't necessarily be a violation. But if there's a committee that's acting directly on behalf or conducting a hearing or taking testimony, then it would need to be a meeting under the OPMA. A bunch of examples. Needless to say, it's not just like I said when we sit up here. If everyone was sitting around at a dinner party and talking about city business and they're all the elected officials or a quorum of them, then it would be a meeting. And emails were a big thing. I think a lot of agencies now have sorted out their appropriate procedures, but when email communications started initially happening, there were agencies who ended up in trouble not realizing they were conducting serial meetings or meetings where one was emailing the other about something and emailing the other about something, and they end up making a meeting accidentally. I don't think very many OPMA violations are done purposefully. So again, the passive receipt of information is okay, but you can't email 3 people and then go talk to a 4th person. Suddenly you made 4 people talking about something outside of a public meeting, taking action or discussing business outside of the public meeting. So when you see our council members or the planning commission sitting around and talking to one another in their meeting, that is the first time that they have all as a group talked about that issue. And so you can see why it does take time to make decisions and why it is difficult. And they ask a lot of questions of staff because they haven't all had the opportunity to hear other people's views about that issue until they're in a room with all of the public and a TV camera on them. So, but for those of you who are on commissions or on council, be careful with social media, because if you see your fellow commission member commenting on something on social media and you want to support them, and then it turns out someone else did that, and someone else did that, and you don't even realize it because everybody's social media is, constantly changing. You may have accidentally, again, been in violation of the OPMA in talking about city business. So regular meetings are the ones, there's regular meetings under the OPMA, and then there's special meetings. So regular meetings are held in accordance with a fixed schedule. The city council meetings are published in the KMC. I'm actually not sure about the planning commission, but they're always by a fixed schedule. The agendas have to be available online. That's a new change in the law. Very limited reasons that you couldn't have them available online at least 24 hours in advance. But the agenda published is not the only business that can be transacted at a meeting. So if you show up to a meeting and it turns out they talked about something not on the agenda, that is perfectly acceptable under the OPMA. And same thing, they could go into executive session even if they hadn't noticed that, as long as it's at a regular meeting. And so there's no restrictions on the type of business, but they do have to have the agendas published at least 24 hours in advance. And Kirkland does that several days in advance for the public so that people have an opportunity to review robust packets of information. Special meetings can be called by the presiding officer or by a majority of the members. So, and then staff helps get those special meetings in place. Often there are regularly scheduled special meetings, but you can call last minute special meetings. You still have to give notice, but to less people. We still want to try and post them online. We have to give notice to media outlets so they can cover it. And then all the members have to be notified, so people can't hold a meeting with only the people they want to come. And for these meetings, this actually isn't on the slide, which was silly of me not to include, but the only business that can be transacted and have final decisions made at a special meeting are the ones that were on the agenda. So don't accidentally take final action on something that wasn't on the agenda at your special meeting. Hopefully staff help you make that choice. And then I'll just quickly cover this, meetings during an emergency. This obviously was very important several years ago. It probably will be important sometime other soon, but there are different rules for emergencies for OPMA. So we've become a lot more flexible and able to meet these. So agencies have to provide an opportunity for public comment at or before every regular meeting where final action is taken. And it can be oral or written, and Kirkland did this even if this wasn't the requirement, but that there has to be an opportunity for public comment. And the one thing is that you don't have to connect the public comment to final action. Kirkland lets anyone, I don't know about Planning Commission actually, at City Council you can make a public comment about anything. Some agencies say you can only comment on the things on the agenda. And when that's the case, it's a little harder to say you can't connect the public comment to the final action. So you have to be given the opportunity to make public comment before final action is taken, before a final decision is made by that governing body. Okay. Let's see. Yeah. And then executive session, the purpose of the executive session has to be announced ahead of time. And then the agency or the governing body has to reconvene at the end of it. Even if it ends early, it has to be at the announced time so no one's left hanging wondering if the meeting's still happening. And if it runs long, they have to announce the new time. Executive sessions can't have any final action occur in executive session. So you might see on an agenda that a governing body's taking an executive session to talk about acquisition of real estate. They can't vote in the meeting to acquire real estate. They have to do that in a public meeting. So you'll see them come out later, a couple meetings later after staff's gotten them information they need to know, and then they might make that decision in public. But they can't vote in executive session on anything. And then now, this last legislative session, executive session has to be entered into the minutes. I think everybody already did that, but apparently someone wasn't because they thought to update the law. Just a couple of common examples of executive session. There's a full list of them in the OPMA 423110, but I think potential litigation, real estate related acquisition or selling of real estate, and then reviewing the applications or reviewing the performance of a public employee are the most often used ones, at least at the city of Kirkland. Okay, the Public Records Act is our next sunshine law. And I just had written something down that isn't here because I realized I hadn't said it. The Public Records Act was first enacted in 1972 by voter initiative. I think there was an earlier comment about voter initiatives with the Shorelines Management Act. The Public Records Act was also by voter initiative. The purpose of it is that the records of the city of all government agencies are presumed open to the public for the reasons we discussed earlier, that it's helpful and promotes confidence. And here's the purpose stated in the statute: the free and open examination of public records is in the public interest, even though such examination may cause inconvenience or embarrassment to public officials or others. And here's, it sort of applies to those you'd think of as agencies. The functional equivalent of public agencies has been sort of a stemming of case law, where some entities were sort of acting like public agencies doing work that seemed, so there's a whole case law series about those. That's second bullet down. It doesn't apply to court records, so if you're here to learn about public records and who you can ask for records from, the court has its own requirements. The legislature can't govern the court's records, and so the Public Records Act does not apply to them. They have a similar public records rule, but the Public Records Act doesn't apply to them, or to private organizations or persons. So if you think you want to request all the records from someone that the city's contracting with, they don't have an obligation to provide you any records, but the city can get you all the records they have related to that relationship. And I'm going to take a quick drink now so I don't cough again. So here's the requirements of the Public Record Act. They have to appoint a public records officer. We've done that. Most cities have that as their city clerk. They have to adopt procedures. The City Council has adopted Public Records Act procedures that govern the Public Records Act, Public Records officer and all staff. Sorry. Okay, and they have to make non-exempt records, this is related to staff, records available for inspection and copying during customary business hours for a minimum of 30 hours per week, excluding holidays. And that's the minimum from the Public Records Act. So that's, Kirkland sort of is all hours that the city's open. And they have to publish a fee schedule if charging for copying or mailing costs, and fees can't be charged for searching, reviewing, or redacting records. And I want to take a minute and point out and sort of describe something to put it into context. In 2016, related to the fees, the State Auditor's Office published a performance audit about local governments and the impacts of the public records on local governments, actually all agencies. They asked 2,363 agencies for information about Public Records Act costs. 58% of cities responded, representing about 79% of the population of the state. And in that year, the most recent year, so 2015, agencies spent $60 million in costs, but received only $350,000 back in fees, so less than 1% of the costs of staff to find and provide public records. And I'm just trying to give you a scope of the amount of work that agencies spend finding, saving, preserving, providing, reviewing public records. $60 million, that's in 2015. I have no doubt that that cost has gone up. Out of those groups, the agencies that did respond, 40% of public records requests go to cities, 26 to the state, 23 to county. So it shows you how interested the public is in its local government, in its most local government. They really are interested in what's happening. Okay, that was a little tangent about fees. Back to the program. Public records are broadly defined, which is why it takes so much work to find them and track them down and provide them. A public record is any writing containing information relating to the conduct of government or the performance of any governmental or proprietary function, prepared, owned, used, or retained by any agency, regardless of physical form or characteristics. So email, videos, websites, anything created on your personal computer, your cell phone, so your text messages about the performance of government or the conduct of government, which is why we urge everyone not to use their personal devices when they're working on behalf of the government, because those are a little more difficult to capture. non-agency email account. So if you want to provide input to your planning commissioner about something on the agenda, don't email them on their personal email just because they're friends with you. Try to email them on their work email so that they can have an easy way to preserve that record. Records requests under the Public Records Act have to be for identifiable records. So they have to be specific and identifiable. This is an important one here. For a request for all or substantially all records owned or prepared used by the agency is not a valid request for identifiable records. This came up because someone was requesting every record that the city of Kirkland, for example, that wasn't it but I don't know if city got it. Wasn't around here when that request was coming through, but every record since inception, since statehood. And that is not a request the court found for identifiable public records, which might sound like someone was trying to hide the ball. It's just impossible. That would have taken a never-ending amount of time to find those records if you could even identify them. So a request for information is not a records request. So if you reach out and you say, I would like to know how many employees you have, we could just answer you. Our staff would, because it's easy to answer that question. But it's not actually a records request. If you said, I want a list of all your employees, that's a records request. So different agencies handle those requests for information different ways. Most of the time, I think that agencies are trying to answer your questions because it will save the effort of looking for the records that ultimately would provide you the answer that you're going to ask for. So most agencies have a public records request form. We urge you to use that because it does help streamline the process. The city of Kirkland has a GovQA web portal. Most agencies now have web portal requests. If they don't, though, use the form. They're not required to, but they do have to give fair notice that they're seeking public records. So you can't sort of like leave a note on the counter by the cashier and say like, give me all your records. Maybe that'd be fair notice, but it would be too broad. And then you can either inspect them, so you could come and sit in City Hall if you don't want copies, or you can get copies. Most of the time, we just give copies electronically because that's the easiest way to do that. Under the Public Records Act, a response has to be given in 5 days. This is part of that sort of like staff time that goes into all this. Either providing the record if it's simple, giving you an internet address. If you asked for all the city council minutes, we could have a quick website that gives you that information without having to reduplicate them for the requester. A quick side note, in case you see an ER in requester, the Public Records Act actually spells requester 2 different ways, so you might see someone spell that different ways. So I tried to use OR all the time. And then, or one of the other things they can do is acknowledge receipt and provide an estimate. We have to provide an estimate of a reasonable time when to provide those records. So we can then push it out if we didn't have enough time, if workloads considerations got in the way, if it turns out that your request seemed small and was actually for a large volume of records. And then the other thing that staff can do is ask for clarification. They still have to provide a reasonable estimate of time, but they can, if your request isn't very clear, they can say, could you clarify this part of it? And we think it'll take X amount of time once you provide clarification. Or deny the request if there are no records, which does happen sometimes. Sometimes someone will say, Kirkland, we want all your records that's for the, that has something to do with an entirely different agency. So, or for example, with the court, which when we would send you to the court. Seeking clarification is, as I described, sort of, if something is unclear. So we can't seek clarification if the request is very clear, but we can ask. A lot of the times requesters know what they want to ask, and it's just not clearly written in a way that we understand, because we have a broad amount of records that we know about, and somebody might be really focused on one thing. So if somebody asked for all the records related to so-and-so's work for the city, that would actually be everything they ever did. But really what they want to know is about that employee's performance, for example, so that we can sort of ask for clarification there. And that oftentimes I think requesters there are a small subset of requesters who are looking for agencies to fail. And they think clarifications are used by agencies to manipulate it and provide less records. But in fact, clarification is used to provide the requester, who most of the requesters are looking for legitimate records, the actual records they want to see. Because if we provide you 500 pages of records, but really what you wanted was 3 pages in the Planning Commission report, that's not going to be very helpful to you. It takes a long time to review them, and it will take you much longer to get them because it'll take a long time to look for them. So it results in prompt disclosure, and then you only have to pay for the records that you get and wanted, not 5 boxes of records about that employee that you asked about. Okay, so this is about staff's obligations for searching. They have to read the request carefully, and in Kirkland we have a public records officer, the city clerk, and then a public records deputy clerk that runs them, and then every department has, well, not the city attorney's office because there's 4 of us, but all the actual departments have actual public records staff whose part of their job, not their full-time job most of the time, is to help facilitate and find and understand the records of their department. And some departments have more than one person who's responsible for that. And then they work with the clerk's offices to find them. So they have to consider all the records. They have to reach out to all the staff that might know anything about it and find it out if it's a broad request. If it's a very narrow request, it won't take that much work. And then the agency, the city here, bears the burden of proving that we adequately searched. So we keep a very detailed record of where we looked, who we asked, what we looked for. And I think a lot of agencies in times past and smaller agencies do end up having problems because they don't accurately document what they looked for. So it's hard to explain later that they did do a reasonable search if they haven't documented that well. So I should actually look at my notes, not just the screen. The Public Records Act is small and it's active. You have to provide records because it's very broad that you need to provide records, and then it's very long if you open up the whole chapter in the statute about what's possibly exempt under the Public Records Act. And this originally had said PRA exemptions are narrowly construed. That's the general case law and understanding. I added most because over the last few years, the legislature has added in additional exemptions that are not narrowly construed. So victims on body cameras, for example, they are required to be removed. Child witness, child interviews, those are required to be redacted. So most are narrowly construed, but some are not. Some are broad, a few of them. But lots of them are narrowly construed and don't have to be applied. So the agency could decide to disclose anyway. Another one that we couldn't decide on is about employees' personal addresses and things. We couldn't just disclose those if we wanted their home addresses. We are required to redact them, or at least give them notice that we're releasing records. So we have to provide an explanation and put that in an exemption log. And then this sort of privacy is one that's not specifically, it's sort of like called out in a couple different places in the Public Records Act. So there's no general privacy exemption where we'd say, oh, that's kind of embarrassing, we'll redact that. That isn't allowed. So if something's redacted under privacy, it's because it met specific requirements of the Public Records Act, including that whatever was redacted for privacy is not of legitimate concern to the public. So, for example, if there's an email where I tell my boss what I was sick with last weekend and then I'm not going to be in the office on Friday, then that probably, the reason I was sick isn't of legitimate concern, just that I was out of the office and that we had a way to document that we don't have staff at work. And then under the Public Records Act, there are, like the OPMA, enforcement mechanisms, because the people, when they voted on the Public Records Act, wanted a way to make sure that their elected officials and that public staff were performing their duties and that they had a way to enforce them if they weren't. And so you can file a claim in state court, and the court can impose civil penalties up to $100 per day per record. Case law for a while was vague on this, but now that's basically like a per page violation up to. They don't have to do that, but the requester doesn't have to show they were damaged by not getting records. And there's a whole, this case cited at the end, Yusufian versus Sims, is where they say, here's what you have to consider in mitigation, and here's aggravating factors. Did they cause delay on purpose in providing records? Did they just not really know what they were doing? Those are aggravating mitigating factors. And then requesters are awarded ER. attorney fees and costs. And there's special provisions about inmates because there are federal and state level, lots of sort of some inmates that make a lot of requests, and so there's different requirements for them. And then outside of the PRA, there can be criminal liability for willful destruction or alteration of a public record. I'll talk really briefly about records retention, but if a record was accidentally destroyed before a public records request came in and you add that record and the agency doesn't have it, that's not a violation of the Public Records Act. That was a records retention issue, and there's no civil claim against the entity for badly retaining unless they did it willfully. So, as an aside. To provide some examples, I sort of gave you the scope of costs from 1 year that it takes to provide records. Here's some examples of penalties in trial court cases that were awarded against agencies for violating the Public Records Act. They all were giant, so I added in a little like Kittitas County one for $16,000, a little less than $16,000, but they can be very large. These are just the ones where people went to court. So lots of times there's agencies settling. This like the UW one reversed for $723,000. They found there wasn't a Public Records Act violation, not that that was an unreasonable fee or penalty. So it can be very expensive for agencies to violate the Public Records Act, even when they do it accidentally. That isn't an excuse. You can still get awarded penalties against you. And so we work very hard to perform our public records obligations, and we ask our boards and commission members, our elected officials, to also work very hard at helping us make sure we get all the records out to people requesting. One of those things that, like, you know, if you just have paper records, most of those we pick up at the end of meetings, things like that, but electronic records now, with the volume of records that we have, that we keep seeing, we see tons of emails. It's incumbent that agencies figure out what to do with emails, right? With the volume of them that come in. So there's different ways to approach it. You could save all the emails ever. That is extremely expensive and not practical. It just costs a lot of money and ultimately energy to store that many records electronically. It does. And then if you said, well, everyone do what you want to do, that doesn't work very well either. It works better when you're training. So we say personal accountability for maintaining your email inbox, and we try to provide staff training on what they need to do to make sure they're saving the right records. And I'm over time. So I will go to records retention. I said there's sort of a schedule that says how long things have to be kept. So for planning commission things, a lot of that stuff, project files for things, those will be kept for 6 years and then transferred to state archives so that they can be preserved for state history. Lots of things are just destroyed afterwards so that they don't have to be kept for a really long time. Thank you. And I think we're doing questions at the end. And I will say, thanks. Adam already introduced himself well, but Adam's our planning and building director for the city of Kirkland. He oversees long-range planning, sustainability, urban forestry, code enforcement, and all aspects of permitting and inspections. He first engaged with city planning as a local government beat reporter for his college newspaper, where he wrote stories about light rail, agricultural land protection, and downtown redevelopment. And then I'll shorten this long one to save you all a little time, but he moved up here from California, and he has a Bachelor in Science in Landscape Architecture from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and where he also majored in English literature, and a Master of City Planning from the University of California, Berkeley. He lives in Seattle, we'll forgive him, with his wife and 2 young children. Please welcome Adam.
Thanks, Darcy. Seattle is like a suburbs of Kirkland these days, so you know, I know it's getting really late, so mainly just wanted to focus on thank yous for tonight. First, I wanted to thank all the speakers, Darcy, Allison, Janice, Ted, and Stephanie, who talked on all these topics. Wanted to also give a big thanks to the attendees who are here tonight. The fact that you folks are taking a couple of hours out of your day, not going to the gym, not reading bedtime stories to your kids, to talk about planning, I think is just really fantastic. And it's a testament to how much we value the community, I think, in Kirkland. And then last but not least, really wanted to give a special thanks to our administrative group, Shay and Patty and Riley, and especially Prinz, who put together this event. And Liz, yeah, sorry, Liz, sorry, I miss you. Liz as well, yeah, who just took a lot of time to put together this event. It really was seamless, and it took a lot of time, so appreciate all that work. Yeah. Just a couple of key themes I wanted to emphasize. Again, this will only take about a minute, but three key things I want to mention. One is that I hope that after tonight we can recognize how extraordinary the planning framework is in Washington State, particularly the Growth Management Act. Councilmember Falcone and I grew up in the Philadelphia area. In Philadelphia, if you start in Center City, Philadelphia, you can drive 60 miles to the west and drive through 60 miles of urban sprawl. Here in Washington, in the Seattle area, you can drive from Pike Place Market for about 45 miles, and within 15 miles or 20 miles, you're in forest and then foothills and mountains. It's a real testament to the strength of our Growth Management Act and how amazing regional planning, statewide planning, and local planning is in the city. Second point is just want to acknowledge that Kirkland is really working hard to implement some of the ideals that we talked about in our state planning framework, accommodating a growing population in a very fixed footprint in the city of Kirkland. We're protecting wetlands and streams, and we're trying to do a better job of that as time goes on, increasing housing choice in the city, locating jobs near transit to prevent urban sprawl. And then the third point I want to make, which is maybe the most important one, is I hope this discussion tonight has helped folks in the audience understand how these planning tools can really empower you as a community member. If you come to a city council meeting or come to a planning commission meeting and can connect your comments and your thoughts on planning issues to the Growth Management Act or our comprehensive plan or other local and state laws regarding planning, your comments will be a lot more effective and will help incorporate those thoughts into our planning documents as we continually modify them. So with that, just wanted to thank everybody again for being here, and then I'm sure we have some questions as well from folks.
Yes, we do have 3 questions on the chat.
First question from Lisa. Can city council members, including the mayor, be on or have a housing council that does not have open meetings or allow the public to attend?
Yeah, it would depend on if that was a public agency. So lots of agencies have elected officials who serve on nonprofits, for example, that are not public agencies, maybe sort of in that private organization, private group capacity. There are also some, like the PSRC is a good example of a regional board. They have a number of people on their commissions. State law defines what their quorums are, so they can have sort of that group of commissions that meet, subcommittees that meet and don't actually take full action. Those wouldn't need to be open, but the full committee making decisions would need to be open. So I think it would really depend on what the housing committee's makeup was, if it was considered to be a government agency or not.
Second question from Anonymous. Do council members comment on social media based mainly on who is fastest to comment, or do they take turns monitoring Facebook groups?
This is Stephanie, and I'm going to have to guess at that a little bit. But I think that there are when you're talking about someone who is an elected official, they have a right to be on social media in their personal capacity, the same as anyone has a right to be on social media. And so if they want to be on social media and comment on things that are going on social media, they have every right to do so. If they have a public political social media platform, then that is likely set up for them, and they can comment in their capacity as a council member or a board member. You know that, well, I'll take that back. That it's limited or restricted, but they can. So I don't know that saying whoever is fastest is going to be the correct response. I think that it's up to personal preference as to whether a council member wants to comment on social media about something or not.
I'm gonna supplement a little though and say, as we noted, if a quorum are commenting on something, they become a meeting, and so our council members, our commission members, I'm sure are all very good at trying to identify if 3 council members or commission members have commented on something on social media. They don't answer because they don't want to make it a meeting, and so it is often the fastest are answering and no one else will. And if you don't see somebody answering or responding, it probably is because they didn't want to turn it into a meeting. And I think that our council is considering policies that they could implement to be able to make it a little more, to potentially make it so that there's different ways that council members can answer on social media, because we do know that a lot of the public is engaging with the city through social media, and that they want to see that their council members and their commission members are also engaged in that same way. And so there are some agencies who have adopted social media policies that limit who and how and when and what sort of order of comments are happening. The city of Kirkland has not done that yet, but it may happen in the future.
The next question from Sarah. If a private citizen or corporation sends an email or memo to one or more city council members regarding city business, is that subject to public records law?
Yes.
Another from Lisa. How and where would one report a conflict of interest or a public meeting violation?
I'm sorry, I was thinking about the last question, which I wanted to also provide a clarification on. For our elected officials, they also get to operate as elected officials and can have their own personal email where they are able to interact with constituents, and those aren't public records. So a city council member by themselves cannot make decisions on behalf of the city. 4 of them have to do that. And so one council member talking to one constituent is not a public record unless it's done on the agency's computer through the emails. So if they have their own sort of constituent email where they want to exchange emails or something like that, have phone calls with them, those phone records aren't suddenly public records just because they had a call with one constituent, because that isn't actually the transaction of official city business. But then what was the next question?
How and where would one report a conflict of interest or a public meeting violation?
Well, there are several ways somebody could do that. The city of, depends on your agency. So lots of agencies have an ombudsman who can look into potential violations. The city of Kirkland has an ombudsman. It's our deputy city manager. So they can look into all sort of ethical violations, and actually the ethics violations of a potentially elected official, or I think our boards and commission members are sent over to an ethics we have a contract with somebody to do ethics investigations so that they can be neutral. For OPMA violations, I mean, somebody can always file a lawsuit against the city. They have to file a claim for damages against the city first, potentially, I think. So that would be a way to give notice. But somebody often At other places I've been, somebody's reached out to the city clerk, for example, as somebody who sort of helps manage meetings to say, I think a violation occurred. What do I do about it? Is this, can something happen? So there's all sorts of different ways that, depending on the agency that you're engaging with, you could report potential violations. So again, most agencies are not trying to flout sunshine laws. Most of the time they happen accidentally. And so if there is a violation, we want it to be corrected, especially with open public meetings, because as we said, the decision was null and void if there was a violation. So we want to fix that.
If there aren't any more questions on the chat, we can look here in the chamber. I think we have a microphone available.
Janice talked about the importance of priority populations in this process. And we know it takes extra effort to reach out to these folks for historical reasons and other reasons. I'm wondering what special effort you guys are going to conduct to ensure that they're heard.
Well, we've tried to reach out to different organizations in the community. We've done public outreach on our email listservs, on This Week in Kirkland. We've worked with, reached out to nonprofit organizations and asked them to, share or encourage involvement. We've reached out to the senior council, youth council, schools. We're trying every avenue we can think of to reach out to our different people that have been, or new people that have not traditionally been involved with our public outreach.
And then if I could just respond a little bit to the last part of your question about how we make sure those voices are heard. We're trying to collect a lot of data, right? So we know the demographics in Kirkland from things like the census or the American Community Survey. And we're also trying whenever we can to collect the demographics of who we're hearing from. So we might be able to compare, hey, 60% of people that live in Kirkland are homeowners, but in our outreach or the people that we're hearing from when we look at our survey results, 80% of our survey respondents are homeowners, or maybe even higher. So we're trying to be transparent about when we notice that happening so that we can point out, hey, we're not hearing from a demographic kind of strata that matches the full community. And so in cases like that, we might also elevate the voices of the people we haven't heard from. So when we're talking to planning commission or city council, we might take extra care to say, hey, folks that identified as lower income had these thoughts about housing. We might have only heard 5% of survey respondents that identify as such, but we're taking the time to make sure you're hearing this input. And so that's one of our plans, is trying to track as much as we can, and we really are grateful to people that are open to identifying and providing us with their demographic information, because it's one way that we can track to make sure we're hopefully getting better and better and better at reaching those folks and building relationships with people, but also how we can be transparent with the community and with decision makers so they know who they're hearing from. Yes, so all of our surveys that we have out, we're collecting demographic information, and we have options for people that prefer not to identify, but yeah, and we're going to make all that raw data available. Thank you for the question, great question.
All right, if there are no other questions, in conclusion, we just want to let you know that a copy of tonight's agenda, the PowerPoint slide, and also the abbreviated short course booklet has been sent out by email to all those who have registered. Copies will also be added onto our website, along with a link to the recording for tonight's presentation. And there is also a post-event survey in the chat, and we'll also be going out to all those who have registered. We'd really like to hear from all of you to know how you enjoyed the program, if there's any areas of improvement, or if there's any other topics that you would like to be considered in the future. So thank you all for coming tonight. We appreciate it.